welcome to the first episode of a new mini-series here on Svarim Chatter, the Baal Shem Tov, History and Legend. And for this mini-series, I'm going to be joined by Professor Glenn Dynner, who is the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Professor of Judaic Studies and Director of the Bennett Center at Fairfield University, and is the incoming Jay Berkowitz Chair in Jewish History at the University of Virginia, UVA. He's the editor of the journal Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies, and a recent Guggenheim Fellow. He's an author of a number of books on Hasidus, and including his most recent, which was published in 2024, which is The Light of Learning, Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust from Oxford University Press. Thank you, Professor Dynner, for joining me for this series. And so I first want to start off that this series is being sponsored by Zalmi Jacobs in memory of his grandfather, Yaakov Katz ben Shneir Zalman HaKohen, Zechariah Levrakan, Zalmi's mother, Chaya Golda bas Yaakov HaKohen, and Liba Katz, all of whom were intrigued by and curious about the Baal Shem Tov and his progeny. So, Zalmi actually reached out to me a couple of years ago about Hasidus, and so through that, I just, decided that it was a good idea to do something, and with Hasidus, decided to start with the Baal Shem Tov. And that really leads to my first question. Why are we starting a series, or really it's not a series, again, this is about the Baal Shem Tov, but is this the natural starting point to talk about Hasidus, you're a Hasidic historian, with the Baal Shem Tov? I mean, again, many listeners are probably like, what kind of question is that? But is this the natural starting place to start off with the Baal Shem Tov?
Well, I think the question behind your question is, what does it mean to be a founder of a movement that you really didn't intend to found or that you didn't set out to create? And that's really the case with Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov or the Besht. I'll be referring to him as the Besht as we go through our program. Basically, the Besht conceived ideas about God and the world that would form the basis of Hasidism, or the Hasidic movement, which really was the most influential spiritual innovation in Judaism since the emergence of Kabbalah in the Middle Ages. The Besht, who lived in what is currently Ukraine from 1698 to 1760, developed a form of worship that enabled people to be holy while living fully in the world. Based on the idea that the divine, or the divine presence, permeates all creation, the Besht taught that the material world could actually be embraced and sanctified and transformed. And so he challenged ascetic forms of mysticism that were predominating at that time that really demanded a withdrawal from the world, self-mortification, and excessive fasting. I mean, young mystics were actually maiming and killing themselves through their excessive fasting. And the Besht offered them a new way, performing commandments with a joyful disposition and a full stomach.
Right. Very different than what was going on at the time. And that's something that we'll get to, which is that, were there Hasidim before the Baal Shem Tov? And that ends up talking about mystics and mystical practices and Arizal and post, Tzfas and Kabbalah and what was going on there. That really ties into this. And I don't know if that's something you wanted to even address now at the time, what was going on with the Baal Shem Tov. But really, I think to focus on, as you said, so the Baal Shem Tov, he didn't set out to start a movement, is what you're saying, essentially.
Right, but he does conceive of a non-ascetic form of mysticism, and that's really crucial. And if you like, I can illustrate it, with a couple of short teachings. I mean, mainly the way you can really identify a teaching by the Besht is they tend to be parables or more simple explanations of a very complex topic. And these are no exceptions. So, for example, one parable that occurs a lot throughout books that contain his teachings refer to the problem of why we should actually be sustaining our physical bodies as opposed to depriving them. And so he gives forth a parable about a prince who received a letter from his father, the king, after he'd been expelled from the kingdom, and he'd fallen in with people of, people of questionable kind of comportment and behavior, commoners. And the prince receives this letter, and he wants to celebrate, but he knows that his friends would never understand the joy that he feels or even believe him. So he orders a round of drinks for everyone so that they'll rejoice with the material while he rejoices with the spiritual, meaning the letter that he received from his father. So the parable is meant to illustrate we similarly have to collaborate with our own bodies, indulge our bodily needs and desires so that our souls, which are like the prince, can achieve a more exalted joy of communion with God. That state is known as devekut, a kind of cleaving or communion with God. Now, part of this really innovative approach to mysticism was how simplified it was. And this can be illustrated through another teaching of the Besht, which begins with a Kabbalistic teaching from the 14th century book Tikkunei Zohar, which explains that when we pray, angels actually carry our prayers from heavenly gate to heavenly gate and from palace to palace. However, this idea seems to contradict another teaching in Tikkunei Zohar, which says something very different. Leit atar panui mine. There's no place devoid of him or devoid of God. And similar to Isaiah 6:3, which teaches lo kol haaretz kavodo, the whole world is filled with God's glory. So why do you need these prayers going from gate to gate and palace to palace if God is found in everything? How do we resolve that contradiction? So the Besht explains that there was once a wise king who conjured an illusion, achizat einayim, of walls and towers and gates, and ordered everyone to come to him through the gates and the towers, and he placed treasures at each gate. And everyone stopped along the way to collect the treasures and then went on their way and returned home. But the king's son, the prince, strove mightily to go straight to his father, the one and only king, and ignored all the treasures and the gates and everything else. And when he reached the king, he turned around and he saw that all the towers and gates and everything were just an illusion. So the lesson we learn from this is our whole world, our material world, is actually permeated by the divine. We don't need to visualize the heavenly palaces or the angels or divine potencies known as sphirot. Those who are familiar with Kabbalah will recognize that term as the kind of emanating potencies of God. Instead, we can access God simply and directly. True, the gates and palaces contain treasures, so they're not strictly an illusion, and so the old-style mystics still receive rewards, but these rewards are nothing compared with meeting the king directly, which then reveals the entire world as being infused with a concealed divine life force. And the conclusion is that asceticism and avoidance of the world are unnecessary because the world is animated by divine light, and we can embrace the world and transform it if we keep that focus in mind. Now, one more thing, it's really important to note here Elliot Wolfson's theory of traditionalism, because he conceives of traditionalism as not something that's invented per se, but rather a process of retrieving abandoned threads of tradition, meaning old teachings, old ideas, and proof texts. And that's what the Besht is doing here. These teachings had already existed since at least the Middle Ages. This teachings about God being ubiquitous in nature and the paradoxical non-existence or illusion or symbolic quality of sphirot, that was all available. But the Besht gives them new connections and a new emphasis that suggests a non-dualistic universe in which materiality and evil don't have any autonomous existence. They too have a divine spark that you can access and kind of visualize. So the Besht doesn't seem to have intended a mass institutionalized movement with these ideas, but clearly they lend themselves to a popular movement because they permit a person to be immersed in the material world while at the same time leading a holy life.
And that's something that, I think is good to start off the series to explain here to the listener. So the Baal Shem Tov, you mentioned Rabbi Shaul ben Eliezer, he's 1700 to 1760 around. And I think you already mentioned we're going to get into more into that, into Podolia, where he is modern day Ukraine, but at the time was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His context, we'll get into that. And just to get it out of the way, he definitely existed. I know that's something that's always been a question. Some people are like, did he really exist? Was he made up? No. We know, first of all, factually, Professor Moshe Rossman, his book, The Founder of Hasidism, he went and he found him in the records there. So we know that he's there, he's found him, he's factual, besides for obviously be quoted, just if anyone needed actual concrete like proof in the records, he's been found in the records, Mishal Baal Shem. And so we're going to get into that. But let's just take a step back. You mentioned Besht, you call him Besht, which is Baal Shem Tov, but he's called, the Baal Shem Tov. So when we're talking about the Baal Shem Tov, what does that even mean? Baal Shem Tov, maybe listeners are familiar with Baal Shem, maybe they're not, but just at least let's explain, let's start off what that name Baal Shem Tov means.
Sure. So the term Baal Shem literally means name master, or a master of the names of God, which refer to a practical Kabbalist, sort of like a shaman or a folk healer, who's able to invoke the names of God for magical healing and shamanistic purposes. Now, this was a professionalization of practical Kabbalah that really occurred mainly in Eastern Europe, and it may be Eastern Europe's major contribution to the history of Kabbalah. Individual Baalei Shem, or name masters, traveled around to customers to drive away demons, heal the sick, ease childbirth, and so on. And all these afflictions were associated with the demonic realm and attacks by demons. The term Baal Shem Tov, or a good Baal Shem, may have been reserved for somebody really special like the Besht, who was considered more special because he had prophetic abilities, he had a willingness to work on behalf of the entire Jewish community, the entire Jewish world even, and he had a really innovative theology, as we've seen. The Besht, in fact, proved so skillful and so convincing that he was eventually invited to settle down in the town of Medjugorje as a resident Baal Shem. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. But he probably continued to travel around to customers to judge by his teachings. According to one teaching that's been discussed by scholars like Joseph Weiss and Elliot Wilson, he taught that traveling from place to place is actually a technique for purifying the divine sparks. At the same time, he also seemed to be happy to be in a single kind of settled place, because the teaching continues that Jacob, or Yaakov Avinu, under whom God folded all the land of Israel, did not have to travel, but he was able to purify the sparks in his own place by means of the study of Torah. So this kind of tension exists, I guess, between the itinerant Baal Shem and the Baal Shem in residence that the Besht eventually became, in his later years.
And this is something that Rossman and Etkes, but there are two major English biographies on the Baal Shem Tov. One is Moshe Rossman, founder of Hasidism, a quest for the historical Baal Shem Tov. That's through Lippmann, and Emmanuel Etkes is the Besht, magician, mystic, and leader, and that's through Brandes. So these are the two. We'll refer to those. There's others, a lot written on it, but those are like the two big biographies on it. And they both go through Baal Shem. What a Baal Shem is, what a Baal Shem means, what a Baal Shem Tov is, and another, so you did it, but you can read, there are others there, and you mentioned Eastern Europe, but there also were Germany, there was a number there as well. And the other part that really is worth discussing is, were Baalei Shem Talmidei Chachamim or not? This has been something that's come up, and many have said, the Baal Shem Tov wasn't a Talmid Chacham because Baalei Shem was like, it was a folk healer, like they weren't necessarily Talmidei Chachamim, and that's been proven false. But just to ask the question, like, how common was it to be a Baal Shem, to be the Talmid Chacham versus just to be like a folk healer?
Sure. Let's begin with Baalei Shem and how common they were in Europe. We know of several prominent Baalei Shem, and that's the way history usually works. You really know of the more famous practitioners because they leave a record. In one case, a Baal Shem by the name of Hillel wrote an entire detailed manuscript, including kind of a memoir, and all his secrets and his recipes and his incantations and so on. that was discovered by a scholar named Yochanan Petrovsky Stern. And one of the most interesting aspects of this manuscript is it shows a lot of cross-cultural cooperation between Jewish and Slavic Christian healers, as well as common techniques that they both derived from the 16th century thinker, medical philosopher and thinker, Paracelsus. Both Jewish and Slavic healers would purchase their herbs and roots and other remedies from the same pharmacies. But there were also differences, such as the Jewish Baal Shem belief in the potency of Hebrew letters on amulets. But the point is that they shared a lot of influences and several very bizarre remedies. Now, the question is, could such people become Talmidei Chachamim? Yes, absolutely. Emanuel Etkes, as you mentioned, has really argued that Baal Shem had a much higher status than was once thought. Both elites and non-elites believed that demons inhabited highways and forests and newly built homes, and priests and sorcerers and Baal Shem alike could remove those demons and compose amulets that defended travelers and homes and so on. There was one really famous and scholarly Baal Shem named Rav Yoel Baal Shem, who enjoyed the status of a Talmid Chacham, which I guess for those less familiar, we should define as somebody who's extremely proficient expert in Talmudic studies. And he was asked to write haskamot, or approbations, kind of recommendations to various holy books, sforim. So claims about the low status of Baal Shem that appear in collections of Hasidic tales, the most famous one being Shivcha Besht, which we'll be talking about, literally translates as praises of the Besht. Those could be anachronistic. I mean, Moshe Rossman argues that these were later 19th century anachronistic descriptions of Baal Shem being low status. I'm not entirely convinced. I think status is a very dynamic thing. I mean, I don't know. Some people swear by their chiropractor and others look down on that profession. You know, it's not so unusual, but a famous chiropractor, I suppose, could have very high status and great deal of knowledge. Not the most perfect example, but just to illustrate, you know, that status is a very fluid and dynamic thing. In any case, the Besht becomes a Baal Shem through, he claims, divine tutelage, right? He learns his skills, and we'll talk about that in more detail a little bit, through like divine sources. However, it's important to note that his mother was a midwife who composed these kind of magical recipes and remedies. And, you know, that's significant as well, because midwives really were kind of folk healers too. And Eli Mojeson, another scholar, has really done a lot of work on the Baal Shem Tov's Baal Shem career, how it continued even after he became famous. He's found manuscripts with the Besht's original magical recipes and formulae that printers later on omitted for one reason or another. And this included a lot of remedies to protect houses from demons that involved amulets and roosters and jars of mercury and needles and recitation of psalms and so on.
Yeah, and this is something that the Baal Shem, we could have an hour discussion just on the Baal Shem aspect of things. Forget anything else. And this is something, as you mentioned, that it's been discussed, and Rossman and Etkes go into this at length, discussing this Baal Shem aspect of the Baal Shem Tov in his career. And so there's much more there. You mentioned another famous Baal Shem is Rabbi Yoel Baal Shem of Chelm. He's one who famously made a golem. He's the grandfather of the Chacham Tzvi, Yaakov Emden. He's quite famous as well, and he was, of course, a major Talmid Chacham. So definitely we know that someone could be a Talmid Chacham and a Baal Shem. It's not impossible. It's not a contradiction at all in any sense. So with that, and as you mentioned, you know, there's more to talk about this in Eastern Europe in general, and in Eastern Europe folk tales and, you know, folk healing and that type of thing. However, also, you know, as you mentioned, and we're going to get more into the scholars on the topic and Moshe Rossman, his opinion of, but it's worth mentioning, you know, what scholars say that sometimes when we're going to get to Shivcha Besht, of course, being the most famous I guess, in most that we have source on the Baal Shem Tov and what, how he's portrayed as a Baal Shem Tov or how he's not portrayed. And was that something, as you were saying, is that status, what that kind of portrayal, looking back on the Baal Shem Tov being a Baal Shem, was that a negative or not? And it's interesting, you see in Rossman's book, you can actually see the original, he reprinted the handwritten ledger where it says, Israel Baal Shem. And that's actually how he's quoted in the records in Meshber. So we'll get to Meshber. So I think at this point we should move on. So we're doing a lot of this as the background. We haven't even gotten to the Baal Shem Tov and where he, when he lived and where he lived. But I think to start is important to lay the groundwork on some of those things and to understand the context. And with that, it's really important to talk about Podolia, where that is. Again, as we mentioned, it's in modern day Ukraine. It was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is, again, very end at the tail end, all the way at the tail end of the 17th century, post-Tachpetat, the Chmielnicki uprising, and we're into, as for the next generation, if you will, and we're into throughout the 18th century, until the middle of the 18th century is where the Baal Shem Tov lives and emerges. So where is Podolia, the context, the culture, the location, and why? And you've hinted at some of this, the Baal Shem Tov parts, but why is this so important for the story of the Baal Shem Tov and the rise of Hasidus, which we'll get to?
Sure. Well, okay, first of all, Podolia was kind of a district. It's part of present-day Ukraine. It had been part of the Ottoman Empire for a time, and those Ottoman influences are really interesting to think about. But at this point, Podolia is part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is what Poland was in those days. It was in a union with Lithuania. It was a huge state, really, possibly the largest in Europe if you don't count, Russia, Muscovy, and it's relatively secure and prosperous for long periods of time, which isn't the way we often think about, Polish Jewish history. And you mentioned the Khmelnytsky uprising in 1648, which was absolutely devastating, but that was more of a kind of exception. It was a real catastrophe. Most Polish Jewish communities in normal times were protected by the nobility because Jews were great taxpayers. They stimulated local economies. They provided cheap credit. And perhaps most importantly, they leased the nobility's non-agricultural enterprises like taverns and mills and tolls, sometimes entire towns and villages, through leases that were known as arendas. And you'll see the term arenda throughout Shifchei Abesht. That's what that is. It's actually misdefined by Ben Amos and Mintz there. It's important that we understand this is a lease that is non-agricultural. It was rare for Jews to lease agriculture, although it did happen. This was known as a derzhavtsa, which is strictly agricultural, and there were Jews who became lessees as well, and Etkes is actually mystifying that. It's important to point out. That is so these are two different kinds of leases, but mainly the non-agricultural ones were what defined Jewish life, that and being merchants, and sometimes international merchants. Anyone who attacked the nobleman's Jewish residence would pay a very heavy price because Jews were proving to be so lucrative and so dependable and peaceful and the source of easy credit and so on. But occasionally that did break down. And anti-Jewish violence occurred not only during the 1648 Cossack uprisings, but also there were organized bandits known as Haidamaks, Oprishki as well, who actually really attacked Jewish communities during the Besht's own day. And there were blood libel accusations that claimed that Jews had murdered a Christian child and used the blood for their rituals, which was totally false, never happened, I shouldn't have to say. In any case, in Podolia, all of these tendencies that characterized the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth seemed like they were on steroids. They were just more pronounced. The region was beset by more wars, by more violence, dominated more by the upper nobility that really enserfed and virtually enslaved the peasant population, which was ethnic Ukrainian peasants of a different religion, really a different form of Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, Uniate. And they'd been in serfs since 1538. And Cossacks were usually serfs who had actually evaded or escaped from serfdom and had become armed kind of bandits, marauders on horseback. And they revolted and they massacred huge numbers of Jews in 1648, something like 20,000 Jews in Ukraine. The numbers vary, but this is, what Shaul Stamford has found. And most Jewish communities at the same time were restored after the 1648 uprising relatively quickly. So by the best time, these communities are flourishing and they're economically, and I would say security-wise better off. So it's difficult to blame the 1648 uprising for Hasidism, as Dubinov and other historians have. This is a long time after, and these communities have really recovered at that point.
Yeah, this is something, just worth saying, in the context of where Podolia is. And again, it's just a region, a state. It's not exactly the country. So then we get to Mezhbush, where the Baal Shem Tov ends up. So let's talk about Mezhbush for a minute before we get to Baal Shem Tov. We'll talk about where he's born and where he is in Middle, where he ends up in Mezhbush, moving around. But something that, and Rossman has a chapter on this showing definitively that Mezhbush wasn't, many people think it probably was a shtetl. They think it was a little, in their mind, what a shtetl is, some little backwater, some tiny village of a few roads. That is not what Mezhbush was. But if you want to explain about it, it's where it's located, its size, its demography, the structure, the economy. Again, Rossman spends chapters and chapters on this.
Yeah, so I'll try to summarize pretty briefly. So Mezhbush, as you mentioned, is a town. It's actually a private town, meaning it's owned by a nobleman, the Tartarisskis at this point. And it really is, as Rossman shows, really one of the main population and commercial centers of the district of Podolia. It has around 5,000 residents, that time period. That was considered mid-sized to large. 35% of those residents were Jewish. Attacks on Jews were pretty rare. And it was prosperous. There were renovations of Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish houses of worship during the Besh's lifetime. The value of the general arenda of the entire town, which was a lease on all the non-agricultural enterprises, increased 14 times by the Besh's day. It had gone from 2,000 zloty to 28,800 zloty, if that helps at all. Jews owned the majority of stone houses and stores in the marketplace, and they had Christian neighbors. So that's important. There wasn't really any ghetto or even a Jewish quarter or Jewish neighborhood. The wealthiest Jews owned stores and homes around the marketplace. They leased the biggest arendas, and they were international merchants, some of whom are mentioned in Shifrei Besh. Social conflicts did happen, but they were inconsistent. It wasn't necessarily between the rich and the poor. The butchers, as Rossman shows, got into conflict with the tailors, and they fought each other over various things. And the Kahal, which is the Jewish self-government or self-governing executive, actually fought or petitioned against the wealthy arrendator, the one who leased the town, and his monopolies. So Rossman shows, that Rossman was by no means the kind of social revolutionary or upstart that historians like Dubinov had assumed he was. He didn't align himself with the poor and the disenfranchised against the wealthy and powerful in any way we can see, in any consistent way that we can see. Though I do want to point out that his teachings definitely will honor the poor and pious Jews. The worker who's chanting psalms all day is, according to traditions in the name of the Best, actually going to be more influential and more appreciated in heaven than the snobbish Talmid Chacham, the scholar, right? And it's trying to really convey a sense of humility among elites, which seemed to be lacking at that point in time.
Yeah, and again, anyone that wants to read more, again, Rossman goes on for this, for a while. So I think at this point, right, half an hour in here to the episode, and we kind of buried the lead. We haven't talked much about the Baal Shem Tov. We told you where he lived and when he lived, but in the context and what a Baal Shem is, but we haven't really talked about him. And I think that's, of course, we need to fix that because he is the series is the Baal Shem Tov. So let's talk about the Baal Shem Tov. Bishol ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov. And we're going to say, I guess we'll start off with his biography. Again, where he's from, where he's born, his youth, his teachers, etc., and all that. And we'll of course later on get into the series and the sources and the Shifcha Besht and all that. That'll be coming up later. But for now, just to give an overview of his basic biography as we know it.
Okay, so Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, or the Besht, is born in 1698 in an unknown town. Historians have often identified the town as Okope. However, Moshe Idel has pointed out that Okope is not mentioned in any printed source as the Besht's birthplace until 1941. So that's extremely late. And Shifcha Besht, which comes out in 1814, the first printing, only identifies him as an inhabitant of Okope, while presenting his father Eliezer as dwelling in something called the States of Wallachia. And Idel, who's Romanian himself, goes through the maps and the Romanian sources, and he finds that there were actually two states of Wallachia at that time, a region in northern Romania, the province of Moldavia, which is referred to in the 18th century as Great Wallachia, and then Little Wallachia, which is today Muntinio, if that means anything to anyone. But Great Wallachia is identified by Moshe Idel as the Besht's father's region. And interestingly, it's known for its small caves where hundreds of Orthodox Christian monks lived in isolation, emphasized simple prayer, the need to combat alien thoughts. All these things will be recognizable to those familiar with Hasidism because these are techniques or habits that the Besht adopted at least during his early ascetic phase. And so it's an intriguing idea. For some reason, scholars of Hasidism have been dismissive of it, but nobody has really offered a plausible alternative or even a refutation. So it's something that's really worth considering. If we move beyond the birthplace, though, we know relatively little about the Besht family. He does seem to have lacked distinguished lineage and famous teachers. And this may be why Shifcha Besht, 50 years after his death, supplies very legendary material about his father, about Rabbi Adam, who supposedly, conveys his teachings to him, and Achia HaShiloni, the prophet, who's, in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, or Hebrew scriptures, is a prophet of questionable pedigree who transmits sacred lore. Interesting choice. In any case, according to a tale in Shifcha Besht that was actually given over by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, these are the first 17 tales in Shifcha Besht. The Besht married Gershon Kitover's divorced sister, Hannah, which does seem plausible for a very talented Baal Shem who lacked distinguished lineage or yichus. Moshe Rossman then discovered real estate tax rolls, known as a chinch, in the Charterisky archives that present the Besht as a tax-exempt resident Baal Shem in Medjugorje, because the Charteriskys were the owners of the town. And the tax list includes his son Hirsch, his daughter Adele, his son-in-law Yehiel, his scribe, and several other associates, and they all resided tax-exempt in a house that was owned by the Kahal, the local Jewish self-government, and the Besht himself is listed as Baal Shem Doctor. He's listed several times, 1740, 1742, 1758, and 1760, which suggests that, after the age of 40 or so, he had achieved his real fame and prominence and had become sort of accepted by the elite. His son Tzvi lived in the Kahal house in 1763, 3 years after his father's death, and their daughter Adele is interesting because she's the one who's portrayed as kind of the more assertive offspring of the Besht in Shifcha Besht. And Tzvi is not really portrayed in a very impressive or positive way.
Yeah, and that's the basics again. And you mentioned you can see at the beginning of Rossman's book, you can see that picture. I'll try to put that on the WhatsApp chat for those who can see the source, they can see that original picture. So you mentioned that about the Baal Shem Tov, and you mentioned something about Yichus. Yichus is important for those that are familiar with this, especially Eastern Europe, what's going on. The elites marry the elites. Anyone with Yichus was a big deal. You don't just come from nowhere and then just become just this big Talmud Chacham and marry someone. Oh, today you can go to yeshiva and you become Talmud Chacham and you get into marrying someone. That wasn't, those days it was real Yichus. You see the who's who, all the rabbinic families are marrying their rabbinic families. Like that's how it works. So it was a big deal. And we see that we married Rav Gershon Kittover. We'll talk about him. He is an important figure, especially in Shiv Chabesht. I mean, the stories about him are endless in there. Not always so positive. We'll get into that. His portrayal or his kind of his attitude towards the Baal Shem Tov anyways. But, as you mentioned here, that's how, who he married. But something else about the Baal Shem Tov. So you mentioned where he's born maybe, and then he lives in Middle and he ends up in Mezhbej. Do we know how he ends up in Mezhbej?
We don't really have a clear picture of that. Unfortunately, it's just, all this information is so sparse and you get a little glimpse here and a little glimpse there. But interestingly, he does seem to have convinced his brother-in-law, he mentioned, Rabbi Gershon Kittover, to move to Mezhboj and to become a tutor for his son Tzvi. And he was apparently supported by the Besht, and he married his youngest daughter to the Degel Machne Ephraim, who was the Besht's grandson before he left for Palestine in 1747. We know a lot more about Gershon Kittover because Abraham Joshua Heschel has compiled a lot of biographical information about him. And, you're absolutely right. He's not portrayed as being a fan of the Besht in the beginning. He's embarrassed by this brother-in-law. Their father had agreed to the marriage match, and the Besht comes and demands, his wife in sort of a crude way, and he's dressed like a commoner. We might speculate that this really was the Besht, but Shivchei Besht tries to say that the Besht was purposely disguising himself as a commoner because he was in a stage of concealment. I mean, who knows, right? But it does. I do want to point out one really important thing about Yichus, and that is it is attainable through, scholarship, of course, but also through marriage. And so by marrying into this family, the Besht does acquire a distinguished lineage in a sense. He does acquire Yichus the way it worked in Eastern Europe in any case. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about Gershon because he's just so interesting and important. He starts out as the Besht's adversary, but becomes his greatest supporter and friend. He was a member of a privately owned old-style Hasidic Klois, which is sort of a special kind of community or physical room for Kabbalistic virtuosi. This first one was in Kute, which is where he gets his name. He was extremely ascetic, an imitator of somebody who tried to imitate his fasting practices, even died, apparently. He was a renowned expert in Lurianic Kabbalah, whom oral tradition describes as volatile. He was quick to anger. In short, he was pretty much everything that the Besht's new approach opposed. He eventually becomes a member of the famous Brody Klois. And Brody, just so you know, is sort of like the Vilna of Galicia or Austrian Poland. It's a really, really important center with many famous scholars and mystics of the old-style Hasidism. It was founded by a wealthy silk, fur, and wax merchant named Jacob Babad, whose nephew actually became a follower of the Besht. Rabbi Gershon was allegedly a judge in one of the rabbinical courts. He eventually moves to Mezhboj, as I mentioned, and then to the land of Israel or Palestine in 1747, like many Kabbalists did. And after he settled in the land of Israel, he really maintained a close relationship with the Besht, sometimes appearing as his disciple and often his dear friend. And the most famous letter we have is a letter from the Besht to Rabbi Gershon, which is known as the Holy Epistle. And this is a really interesting and complicated topic. I don't know how much I can really get into the weeds, but there are several versions, competing versions, and scholars argue about which one is more authentic. There was a scholar named Joshua Monshine, a Lubavitcher scholar, who argued that there were actually two letters, and there is one that's alluded to, and he claims that two of the versions are the older letter and the new letter, and this was recently supported by another scholar named Alon Goshen Gottstein, who's analyzed the difference between the letters. But there's also an argument by Eli Moseson and Rossman too that these are not two different letters; they're actually just versions. And Moseson will argue that the Koretz version, which was actually printed in Ben Porat Yosef by Yaakov Yosef Polonoi, is the most authentic and complete version of the second letter, and the first letter was simply lost. And, for our sake, I think we should look at the Koretz letter because it really does represent the most complete version, whether it's a later amalgamation of the two letters, as some claimed, or whether it's an earlier, more complete version of the second letter. As Moses claimed, the important thing is that it really does have the most complete and really the juiciest information. It describes a 1746 ascent by the Besht in great detail. And he goes up and he actually meets the Messiah, and he asks him when he's coming. And the Messiah replies, "By this you shall know, once your learning or wisdom becomes publicly known and is revealed in the world, and your fountains have overflowed beyond what I've taught you and what you've achieved, and others too are able to perform mystical unifications and ascents just as you can, then all of the demonic husks shall terminate, klipot, and it will be a time of favor and salvation." And the Besh admits that he became very worried by this, and it pained him, because this would really, really take a long time. Yet he did learn 3 charms and 3 holy names, which are easily learned and explained, and so he calmed down. And then he tells Rabbi Gershon, "Unfortunately, I was not given permission my entire life to reveal this to you, and I asked on your behalf to teach it to you and was not permitted, and I was sworn to this. Yet this I shall inform you, and let the blessed Lord assist you, that while you are praying or studying, in each and every utterance and issuance from your lips, intend to make a unification of it. For in each and every letter there are worlds and souls and divinity, which rise and commune and bind to each other, and afterwards the letters commune and unify thoroughly and form a word and are truly unified with godliness, and you will include your soul with them at each and every level of the above, and all the worlds will unify as one and rise and make unaccountable joy and delight." Okay, so he gives them this kind of technique for praying and studying, which involves contemplating the letters. Now, the letter continues, is very long. The Besh then meets Satan and asks him about blood libels that occurred in the community of Zaswav, where several souls allegedly, converted to Christianity but were killed anyways. It actually turns out, according to archival sources, that only one person converted. His name is Zorach Leibovich, and this is a Polish scholar who found this. And any case, he asks why this occurred, and Satan gives an explanation. And then he says a few more things to Rabbi Gershon, which I can just summarize. He asks him to review the words of morals, the musar that he's taught him, and always have them in mind. He apologizes for not having sent funds because there's been a plague and there's been hunger. He even describes in the letter how he warded off the plague, at least from Medjugorje. And finally, he brags about his about Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Sudilkov, the Degel Machne Ephraim, who's going to be he's a great prodigy. He's going to be a great scholar one day. And then he signs it your loving brother-in-law who hopes to see you face to face and prays for a long life for you and your wife and children, seeks after your welfare daily and at night as well for a long life. Amen. Salah. So to conclude, the Besh is presented in this letter as a Baal Shem, right? As somebody who's a mystical practitioner who believes very strongly in the magical force of the letters and so on, but also as a mystic. And most importantly, as a Baal Shem who's now working on behalf of entire communities and thinking about his legacy. How will his teachings and techniques spread after his lifetime? He still does not seem to conceive of a mass movement of Hasidism, though, in any institutionalized sense.
Yeah, this is really the source that we have, one of the source of the Baal Shem Tov and pertaining to the Baal Shem Tov. And as you're saying, he's not your standard Rebbe with a Hasidic court at this time when he's writing this letter. You see, he's saying that he needs to support his family, and that's why he couldn't send him Gershon money. By the way, you can read a full translation in Rossman's book, page 106 to 108. You can look it up online. And the part you mentioned, the different questions about the different manuscripts and the different versions of this letter that we have, the printed version, and then there's the different ones, and that's been a discussion between Manshine and other scholars and Rossman, and everyone's involved in this question at some point. And for what, I think you summarized it well for as it pertains here to this discussion. Obviously, as with any podcast episode or miniseries, if anyone's interested in more, especially like the Baal Shem Tov, like I mentioned, there's 2 books, there's many other articles and books. You can read so much on this topic. We're just giving the general overview of it, even if a kind of an in-depth overview, if you will. And so with the
I just wanted to point out, though, that the Etkis book on the Besht actually has 3 versions of the letter and the complete chorus. So that's really the one I would recommend. It's in the appendix.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. It's in the Etkis book, it's in the back, and it's actually, they put it side by side. So on the page, there's 3 columns, which is very nice, and you can compare it, right? The Rossman one is the older one, just the printed version, and he breaks it down. But it's, again, worth pointing out the letter. So that's really what the letter of the Baal Shem Tov, and that's really what we have. Letter to Rabbi Gershon. There's some other sources. There's some other original, perhaps material from the time, and of course the Shifchei Besh, which we'll get to. So I think really here is worth asking you is that, again, Shifchei Besh we're going to get to, not in this episode, but we're going to get there. And the question of Shifchei, not on Shifchei Besh, but the question just in general. So a lot of what we said here, obviously now we have biographies by Rossman and Etkis and other writings today, sitting here in 2025. But what source material are they working off of? Or really, this whole conversation that we've had in this episode, where is that material coming from? Is that from Shifchei Besh? Is that from here, the letter? Where is most of this material coming from, the sources that we know about the Baal Shem Tov?
Right. So if we're going to talk about supposedly authentic teachings of the Besh, we're very limited. We're limited to Forum holy books that come out beginning in 1780. So, right, that's like 20 years after his death. The most famous ones being Toldot Yaakov Yosef by Yaakov Yosef of Polanoia, Magid Devarav Yaakov, which is the Magid of Mezritz's teachings, and you could add perhaps the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, actually not so much the Tanya, but other books, in the Lubavitcher corpus, and Degel Machaneh Ephraim would be a great source as well, and Keter Shem Tov. These are the original Hasidic holy books, Forum, that contain the best teachings. If you want to talk about direct quotation, we are limited to that holy epistle that I just went through. There's also a letter in Shifchei Besh that we can talk about perhaps in a later episode that also, seems to be original Beshian. And then we have a couple of other letters as well that refer more to his magical and mystical activities than to his teachings. But, we're forced to really construct his intellectual biography based on these secondary sources in a lot of cases, which is why the primary sources that I just referred to are so precious to us, and they're studied again and again and again for every possible detail, because you really get his voice. And if I were to summarize his voice, I would say it is folksy. It's very simplified. He loves parables.
Just one of the final things on this episode is when we get to his students, you already mentioned Rav Gershon, his brother-in-law. We mentioned Toldos Yaakov Yosef. You mentioned him, and there's the whole story with him, how he got to the Baal Shem Tov, and then he ended up getting chased out of the city. He's fired Erev Shabbos, and he runs out Erev Shabbos. There's that whole famous story. You mentioned the Maggid of Mezrich. You mentioned really the core Talmidim. There's a couple of others as well that that are around here, like his circle. But regardless, as we, I think it should be made clear, and it has probably been made clear throughout this episode, he wasn't your standard Hasidic Rebbe with the Hasidic court like is going to come later. That is definitely not what's going on. And so that's definitely not what's happening at this time. So I think the conclusion to this episode, right, would be, how would you like to, I'll leave it to you. How would you like to conclude this episode before we continue on? And of course, in the next episode, I'll let you end this episode, and then I'll say what we're going to do the next episode for the listener.
So let me conclude by saying it wasn't only the brilliance of the teachings, this simplified kind of brilliance, it was also the fact that he manages to gather around him these old-style Hasidim, these ascetic mystics who are ruining their lives. As you mentioned, Yaakov Yosef of Polanoia had been ejected from his community because of all his fasting and isolation. The Maggid of Mezrich, who we mentioned, had really become disabled as a result of all his fasting. He had a problem with his legs, and so on and so forth. These mystics who are almost killing themselves actually find a way to be holy and pure and spiritual virtuosi by not doing that to themselves, right? And that really has to be appreciated as the major innovation, that you can take the world of mystical thought, ideas, and practices and turn it on its head and say, you can actually do better. You can become more holy by embracing materiality with a certain kind of a focus, right? And we can go into that in more detail, but the basic idea is to recognize the divinity that permeates all things, access it, transform materiality, and you have to do that by engaging materiality and matter, and that must have come at a huge relief, as a huge relief to his disciples and his inner circle, who could actually now be a little healthier, and serve God in joy, and perform the commandments in a state of joy and not in a state of suffering. And so that has to be the explanation for the great popularity of the movement as well.
Okay, and that's something that we'll get to. We teased that, we mentioned Chassidus before the Baal Shem Tov and what's going on, ascetic practices, and the Baal Shem Tov's, various other things. There's a lot more to discuss about him that we haven't get to, so we'll get to that in the next episode. His relationship with the rabbinate and laymen and mystics and so on. You mentioned some teachings of his, but other written Torah, what do we have from him? So there's more there to get to, and we'll get to that. And of course, Shivchei Besh. So with that, thank you, Professor Dynner, for joining me on this first episode of the mini-series about the Baal Shem Tov.
Okay, thank you.
In the back of the wagon of the Baal Shem Tov, in the back of the wagon of the Besh. With who? In the back of the wagon of the Baal Shem Tov, in the back of the wagon of the Besh. Yeah, my man, Afi, in the back of the wagon of the Baal Shem Tov. I'm in the back of the wagon.